Hi, and welcome to Terry Talks Movies, and welcome to Science Fiction Saturday again. I've got two movies for you now. I've got one from 1951, which is kind of basic science fiction space opera. Second one's from 1974, and it's a Spanish science fiction horror movie. It's a rarity. It's just been released on Blu-ray by Mondo Macabro, and it's a little thing called I Hate My Body, also known as Odio mi Cuerpo. And it's really a bit unusual, and it feels a lot more contemporary than it is because it addresses some issues which are now quite prominent in social media and in the political world and in the social world. So let's get started with the first one, a little thing called Fly from Mars from 1951. It was filmed in a film process called Cinecolor. So the colors look a bit off because Cinecolor prints kind of went weird like a whole bunch of other film processes that were trying to challenge Technicolor did. It was directed by a guy called Leslie Salander, who's kind of interesting because he made 127 feature films, 107 of which were Westerns. He was a Westerns guy who suddenly gets this low-budget science fiction movie about flight to Mars and makes the movie. The movie uses leftover costumes from Destination Moon and some leftover props and things from Rocket Ship XM. So it's a bit of a Frankenstein together piece. Apparently, the principal photography took a total of 5 days. The movie stars Cameron Mitchell, Margaret Chapman, who was a movie starlet who by this stage was 32 years old, wasn't quite in her first bloom of being a movie starlet, and Arthur Franz, who turned up in a whole bunch of different interesting movies in the 1950s, including a little thing called The Sniper, which is a really spectacular small film noir. The movie starts out in the best possible 1950 science fiction going to Mars movie way. Two scientists sitting next to a giant telescope talking about going to Mars. It's a trope that's been used since then in a whole bunch of movies. If you look at the extras in Amazon Women on the Moon, it's got exactly the same setup. So there's a mission to Mars. So 5 people are going to Mars. A physicist, Dr. Lane, the usual kind of older guy. Professor Jackson, who's kind of short of money, and so he does some press interviews to make a few bucks for his family before he goes to Mars, which is an interesting little side note. A spaceship designer, Jim Barker, played by Arthur Franz. Carol Stafford, who is his assistant and also helped design the spaceship. She's played by Virginia Houston. And a journalist, Steve Abbott, who's a war correspondent, played by Cameron Mitchell. And Cameron Mitchell, it's kind of mid in this one. He gets to do some dialogue, which he doesn't really sell to us, but it's one of those cheap movies that was made in 5 days. You've got to cut some slack. They take off lying on bunk beds, and then they move to what look like very posh office chairs when they're running the spaceship. They lose contact with Earth part of the way there with a meteor storm, and the meteor storms are those usual 1950 science fiction movie meteor storms, where they look like somebody's throwing charcoals at the camera. They do have another means of communicating with Earth, which is basically drone rockets that they fire back to Earth with stuff put into them, like records and bits of paper and scientific notations and things like that. They put them in these little rockets that are about that long and fly them back to Earth. I'm not sure how that works, but apparently it does. So they crash land on Mars because the landing gears got balked by all of these meteors and things like that hitting them. And they find an underground civilization on Mars led by a guy called Ikron, played by Maurice Ancram, who usually played army generals and other things in these low-budget movies. Everybody on Mars speaks English because they've been listening to radio broadcasts. And in spite of the fact they have very advanced society, very advanced technology, they haven't been able to successfully send radio communications to Earth, and they haven't been able to get a rocket together to travel from Mars to Earth, even though it's easier launching from Mars than it is from Earth because the gravity's less and the planet's smaller. But science isn't part of what this science fiction movie is about. So the Earth people get taken to an underground city, and there's some quite nice matte paintings showing the underground city, and all credit to them for that. They're not perfect, but at least they made the effort to show some of the scale of the underground city. Now, there's a weird love triangle in this movie which plays off really clumsily. There's Cameron Mitchell's guy, Steve Abbott, the journalist, Jim Barker, the Arthur Franz character, and Carol are in a love triangle. Steve is kind of hot on Carol. Carol's been hot on Jim for years, but Jim seems to not care for women very much until he meets a woman on Mars called Alita, played by Marguerite Chapman, at which point he suddenly discovers his hormones and his balls drop. So you got this weird kind of quadrangle of relationships which play out like everybody's 15 years old. But you gotta like that. But the Martians then decide they're going to help the Earth people repair their spaceship and rebuild it using their engines and using their technology and using advanced Martian materials to do that. But the Martians have a secret. They're running out of the radioactive element corium that they use to power their civilization. And in about 10 years, Mars is going to die. They're not going to be able to produce enough oxygen. They're not going to be able to produce power and warmth. All of Mars' civilization is going to go tits up. So they're planning to let the humans from Earth build a spaceship, then they're going to take it over at the last minute and basically go and get as much uranium as they can from Earth. It's not a particularly well thought out plan, but that's what we got. So you've got this political intrigue behind the scenes where the Earth people, having found out that the Martians have got this plan, have to try to sneakily speed up the completion of the repairs on this spaceship before the bad Martians decide to take it over. They want to take the good Martians with them, which is Alita and her father, Tilamar, who are on the side of the humans and want to build a relationship with her so that trade can be done and the Martian civilization can be saved. Movie's not great. Movie is basic. The acting is no better than it needs to be. Runs 72 minutes, so it's definitely a second feature in a double feature of movies. But it's kind of fun. It's got that usual thing which so many 1950 science fiction movies had, particularly space operas. All the women from another planet are attractive, wear high heels, wear contemporary makeup, and are hot. Whereas all of the guys who are kind of attracted to them are like 6s or 7s at best, which is kind of weird. And I suppose it's put in place by movie studio producers and movie studio heads and movie studio directors who are dating well above their level. I kind of enjoyed this one. I didn't love it, but it's got the usual tropes. And it did this a lot before movies like Catwoman on the Moon or Queen of Outer Space and all of those kind of movies. So this one was at the head of that. Go to another planet, find hot chicks, come home again. It was well before the other one, so give it a little bit of credit for that. Science fiction made by people who don't know the first thing about science fiction. But it does okay, and it's interesting seeing an actor like Cameron Mitchell who did some interesting stuff at various stages in his career, even though he was definitely a B picture actor. I mean, he's very good in an episode of The Night Gallery with Elsa Lanchester, where she plays an old lady with a green thumb. He was good in that. He's good in a couple of other things. But Cameron Mitchell, who has been mocked by not only Mystery Science Theater 3000, but Red Letter Media as well. In this one, you see a younger version of him when he was still an up-and-coming actor. Yeah, he wasn't too bad. He was okay. Wasn't great, but he was okay portraying a character who is just a little less cliche than would be in the hands of some other actors. So I watched Flight to Mars and kind of enjoyed it. But then I was wandering around the internet, as I tend to do, and I found a movie that I had just found a digital copy of it. Something Weird Video put it out 30 years ago on a very bad VHS transfer. And it's got such a cool concept to it that I thought, I wonder if there's a copy I could get. I wonder if there's a copy on physical media on disc that I could get. And I found out that Mondo Macabro have just fairly recently found an original print of this, struck a 4K transfer from it, and released it on their own imprint in a limited edition. I think it's 1200. Yeah, 1200. This is 10/12 of 1200. It's a movie called I Hate My Body, starring Alexandra Bastido from The Champions. It's a Spanish film about a very weird scientific experiment. You see that on the cover there. The brain of a man, the body of a woman, the sexual horror story of our time. Not sure it is, but you got to put something on the blurb. Now, this Mondo Macabro release is good. It looks crazily crisp. There's the back cover. I'm going to show you all of the back cover there. Inside you get the disc, and this is region free too, which I really appreciate. There's nothing I love more than a rare movie on region free. So there's your disc there. And you get a booklet about the director. Now, the director was a geezer called Leon Klimovsky, who lived from 1906 to 1996, made a whole bunch of different films. I can't show you the cover of this booklet unless I cover up Alexandra Bastido's Busty Substances. But you get a bit of a kind of history of this weird little Spanish director. Now, Spain in the 1970s was going through a transition. It was right at the end of the Franco regime. And movie censorship was easing up a bit. So the horror movies got just that little bit edgier, and the subject matter was enhanced by a whole bunch of other things. By the way, there's the back of the booklet showing the mad scientist, Alexandra Bastido. And at the top, you've got the woman who helped the scientist do the operation. The back cover of this has pretty much the best blurb about it. Lecherous businessman Ernest and his friend Peter go out for an evening of fun with two girls from work. There's a lot of drinking and dancing. They decide to swap girlfriends for the night. And so Ernest goes into the car drunk with this chick and crashes the car. And he's in hospital and his body's been destroyed, but his brain's intact and still functioning well. Dr. Adolf Berger decides this is a perfect opportunity. I'm going to do my experiment I wanted to do since I worked in Nazi death camps 30 years ago. And so he finds that in the hospital there's a brain-dead young woman called Lida Schmidt, played by Alexandra Bastido. And so he goes, yeah, okay, what I'll do is I'll transplant this guy's brain into this woman and see how we go. The operation's successful. Ernest wakes up in the body of Lida. And Lida is muy caliente, very hot woman. And so he wakes up, he's recovering in the clinic. Nobody knows this operation's been done except for Berger and his assistant. And Lida / Ernest heals and then decides to escape from the hospital, sets fire to the bedding. Berger gets burnt to death in the fire. And Lida escapes and tries to go back to Ernest's life. Ernest is married because he was just stopping this chick on the side. Goes back and meets his widow and her new boyfriend, who is his best friend. And Lida / Ernest decides to try to get some of the money from the insurance claim that his widow makes. She denies there's an insurance claim. Lida pretends to be a girlfriend of her husband and then goes away and then tries to live as Lida. And Lida's got a flatmate who's kind of swinging, and suddenly Lida is a totally different person psychologically. Meanwhile, going to and from all these places, Ernest in the body of Lida starts finding out all the macho shit that men were doing in the 1970s. She gets felt up on a bus. She's treated in a kind of pat the knee kind of way by people she tries to get a job with. The movie is ostensibly set in Switzerland, but it's actually filmed in Spain. And the reason the director did this is because he didn't want to get in trouble with the authorities by claiming that there's anything wrong with Spain. So it's set in Switzerland, but the machismo and the social criticism this movie carries is very much about 1970s Spanish society. Very bold move, kind of right on that tightrope. It becomes really interesting. Lida has to find a job and ends up working in a nightclub as a kind of 10 cents a dance girl, and she's expected to go off with men, but she doesn't. And her sexuality is really messed up. She's attracted to her flatmate, but when they start kissing, she realizes that it feels weird because she doesn't have a schlong anymore. And so that gender disparity in the character's mind. And there are scenes where Lida is getting molested by somebody or is attracted to a woman and starts kissing her. And you see the male actor who played the previous Ernest in those scenes. So they kind of flash between Lida and Ernest to get the idea that this is still the same person. It's a very, very weird movie. And it's a Frankenstein kind of movie, but it's also about gender roles and about sexuality, an involuntary change of gender. Now, there are other movies that did this. There was a comedy called Goodbye Charlie with Debbie Reynolds and Tony Curtis in the 60s. There are things like The Skin I Live In and another one with Michelle Rodriguez, which went in some interesting directions. But this one's fairly early in the game. I mean, Goodbye Charlie was about being reincarnated in a different body. And it was more kind of a lightly sexy rom-com with Tony Curtis and Debbie Reynolds. Debbie Reynolds playing reincarnated Charlie, of course. But this one takes the concept seriously and uses it to hold up a mirror to what was then contemporary society. It doesn't do it as hardcore and as successfully as some other movies might have done it later. But given the fact that Spain did still have a fair bit of censorship, it goes as far as they could go in showing this person who is in a body that does not match their brain. And I know any number of people for whom that's the situation now. I mean, every few months I find another friend who comes out as trans or has surgery done to rectify their gender and all that kind of stuff. But this is a 1974 exploitation movie from a very Catholic and somewhat repressed society. And yet it's still got the balls, and I use that term advisedly, to start looking at gender roles in the way that gender affects the way people are treated. Lita has lots of qualifications, having, as Ernest, been a very successful engineer. But she can't get a job as a woman in those particular jobs because men won't work under a woman in that society. And she can't hold down even a factory job because the sleazy guys running the factory will start to mac onto her. And that's attempted by one of the executives there, who then sacks her for not putting out. Very interesting film. And most of the movie, after we get the initial setup, is a whole bunch of vignettes of gender inequality in 1970s Spain. Mind-blowing. This movie is worth checking out. It's worth finding cover. This one, I think, was $27 US when I got it from Mondo Macabro, which isn't too bad for quite an unusual, rare Blu-ray. But I've just found it so fascinating how it says so much and has discussion points that are still being argued these days. Really interesting small film. Really interesting cult film. Really interesting science fiction film. Or if you want to, horror film. It's in a genre which the Spanish had in the 60s and 70s, mostly with the Paul Naschy kind of monster movies. A thing called Fanta Terror, where fantasy and terror mix. But this one's rock solid science fiction because it is about, transplanting a brain into another body, which is innately a science fiction concept. Really interesting. Alexandra Bastido is beautiful. Not the best actress in the world, but she does give us a couple of character beats that really hit well in this movie. Most people, of course, know her from The Champions in the 1960s. But in this one, she is doing a challenging role. Playing a man's brain in a woman's body is kind of interesting. And there is some body language she uses. She doesn't walk in a female kind of way. And her clothing and the wardrobe is somewhat ambiguous at times. And the character, the confusion of the character and the challenges of the character are there. I mean, of course, there were things they didn't address, like menstruation and female sexuality in the sense of female arousal isn't really addressed because they couldn't really go there in the 1970s in Spain. But I like this one. It surprisingly delighted me so much. It's ahead of the curve. It talks about things way in advance of when society particularly was talking about things. And I really enjoyed it for that. So that's what I got for you this time around. Kind of lame-ass space opera and quite a challenging and interesting science fiction about gender from the 1970s. I love finding movies like this. Weird movies that nobody's talking about and nobody really remembers particularly well. But it's so rewarding when you find them. Thanks a lot for watching. Usual things, please subscribe. It doesn't cost you anything. Give it a thumbs up. Ring the bell to be notified when new videos are coming up. Leave a comment on what you think of these movies and whether you're interested in particularly I Hate My Body or even Flight to Mars, whether you've seen that. You can also support the channel. By the way, I've got a little announcement at the end of this video. You can also support the channel, of course, by becoming a channel member on YouTube, donating through YouTube, or becoming a patron at patreon.com/JerryTalksMovies. I was going to do a reverse advent calendar where I'll put one movie a day into a box, and then at the end of 24 days, that box will be raffled off to somebody who's a channel member or a patron. I'm not doing that. I'm doing a special video that'll come out tomorrow where I'm going to show you all 24 movies, because a lot of family stuff going on at the moment, and I didn't have time to get together 24 individual short films. So I'm going to show you all of the movies tomorrow, and then I'm going to announce it to the channel members and to the Patreon people over at Patreon so that they can opt in or opt out of being put into the raffle for winning these movies, which will then mail to them. And if you become a channel member or a patron between now and Jingle Bells, you can be a part of that as well. So it's not just for the people who are already established as financially supporting the channel. And there are going to be some good movies in that box. There are some DVDs, there are some Blu-rays, there are even 4Ks in there. So it's not just any shit that I find in the back room. It's going to be some really interesting films. Next up, we've got the live stream on Monday morning, 7 a.m. my time, and we've got a lot of stuff to talk about there. So until all of that stuff happens, watch some good movies, watch some bad movies, find some really weird obscurities, and just have your mind blown. And I'll catch you next time.